Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed. And they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord. Now, in the Gospels, we see that the ministry of Jesus was mostly in Galilee and perhaps other places comfortably far from Jerusalem and the rigid control of the temple priests and the scribes. They called it Galilee of the Nations because it was a mix of Jews and Gentiles. And that's where Jesus chose to live. More specifically, he moved from Nazareth to Capharnaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, maybe 2 or 3 days walk from Jerusalem, or from Nazareth. It's called the Sea of Galilee Sea, but it's hardly more than a quarter the size of Lake Simcoe. But that would be a sea to people that have never been anywhere except where they were born, and I've never seen any other water. Anyway, I've been there, and I came by boat from another part of the Sea of Galilee. And I went to the synagogue. It's still there. It's not in such good shape, but it's there. It's got some pillars and walls and benches for the congregation. And it's very still and very quiet, nobody else around. And I sat there for an hour. And I was aware that that was the place where it all started. But beyond that, I just sort of sat. And I've been, in a way, thinking about it ever since, on and off. And if not thinking about it when I remember, it's sort of a centering point in my life. Anyway, if you look at the first reading from Deuteronomy, it's the text that begins the tradition of the prophets. In Judaism, and maybe in every religion, there are 2 strains. There's the law and the prophets. The law is administered by priests or some other authority. And the priestly strain holds the thing together. Priests are anointed, they're official, they've got authority. They preach the tradition, and they keep an eye on how people comply with it. Despite Harry calling me father all the time, I'm not operating as a priest. Now, the strain we're less familiar with is prophecy, because prophets generally aren't so visible. And the ones that are visible are very rarely well accepted. They're not ordained, they're not anointed. But God chooses them and gives them a task or a message. Prophets critique the system which the priests maintain, and they critique the way that people are living that. If you have both prophets and priests, your religion will have a wholeness or an integrity. If you have just priest, 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 you keep repeating the party line, and everything's about loyalty and conformity and following the rules. And that looks like religion, but it might not have too much life in it. But with priest and prophet, you can have a system that constantly refines itself, or it corrects itself from within. No, it doesn't always come together. We see it together in Moses, who both gathers Israel together, gets a priesthood ordained, and it's yet most critical of his own people. We see it again in Jesus, who loves his people, but he's lethally critical of hypocrisy and illusion and deceit. We see it even in Luther, who tried to be a good priest, but was squeezed out by teachings, by rules that his conscience couldn't accept. So, are there any contemporary prophets? Can we point to any? There's more than you might think, but they keep a low profile. Now, you may have noticed it in the reading of the gospel, but it says twice, he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And then all of them were amazed. What is this? A new teaching with authority. So what authority? Somebody holding a sign saying prophet? Certainly not from the temple. Now, Jesus' words, as he spoke them and as they were heard, were a truth spoken from an inner authority, a powerful one, a powerful truth that penetrated the minds and the hearts of the people that were listening to him. Today's prophets wouldn't think of themselves as prophets, yet they do have that inner authority and the grace to speak it by word or by example. And here's some examples. Catholic ones, but anyway, they'll work. In 1585, that's a long time ago, the prophet Mary Ward was born in Yorkshire. She wanted to become a nun and did become one. But in those days, nuns were strictly enclosed and not allowed to engage in any ministry outside their convent. She tried in a number of ways to teach the poor or to serve them, but was always denied. But she was not forgotten. Years later, the Loretto sisters were founded, not to stay in their convents, but to teach the young and to serve the poor all over the world. And they looked to Mary Ward as their founder, and her prophetic vision is rewarded because the truth of her gospel, of her response to the gospels, resonated long after her death and overcame the priestly rules. And from the Loretto sisters came another prophet, Mother Teresa. There used to be a humor magazine called Punch. The editor was Malcolm Muggeridge, very funny, very cynical. One day, he decided to go to India and expose Mother Teresa as a fraud because she couldn't be real. That's what he did. He went to India and he met Mother Teresa and began to put his expose together about what a fraud she was. Then all of a sudden, he stopped. He put his typewriter aside and he fell in love, just like that. He listened to her and he fell in love. And he stayed there, not just for a couple of days as he planned, or for a couple of weeks, but for a couple of years. Now, later, back in England, people said, "You've changed. What happened?" And he'd say, "She speaks the truth. When she speaks the truth." Now, that's what prophets do. The prophet, Jesus, did it for us and to us. He comes to speak the truth into our minds and especially our hearts, the truth of ourselves, the truth of life. And the truth is the good news. It's forgiving and loving and encouraging. And we pray for the desire and the openness to hear it and to speak it ourselves. Muggeridge, the curmudgeon and lifelong cynic, said, "When you hear the truth, your heart leaps and you hold it fast." Just as a remark, I might say that our formula for baptism says to the newborn or whoever's being baptized, as Christ was anointed priest, prophet, and king, so may you live always as a member of his body, sharing everlasting life. And so we believe that for those who are called to exercise their prophecy, that they've been baptized into it. And it has degrees. It's not all just yelling and changing things. It's being there with a voice and speaking from conscience and heart and prayer for something like a church council or voting or anything like that.